Hey, this is Dr. Jason Johnson. I am back. You are on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining me. Yeah, as usual, a lot to talk about. So, as I always say, like, subscribe, be prepared to share this. This is going to be a very interesting conversation. We've got like 3 completely different topics we're going to talk about. For those of you who are watching this on Instagram, you should know the routine by now, but there's always new people. I'm only going to talk for about a minute on Instagram, and then you want to go see the full discussion on Dr. Jason Johnson. That's my YouTube page. That's where we're having in-depth conversations. Breaking news is for Instagram. In-depth conversations and discussions are going to be on YouTube, including a really cool announcement that I'm going to make at the end of today's discussion. And I'm going to say this because there's a lot to talk about. So first, 3 things. We always talk about 3 different things. First, we're going to talk about Jake Tapper's book. We're going to talk about the significance of this book, not the book itself, the significance of this book. Number 2, we're going to talk about Trump's meeting today with President Ramaphosa of South Africa. And number 3, we're going to talk about Caitlyn, Clarke, Angel Reese, RG3, and Ryan Clarke. So a lot to talk about today. And we're going to start right now with Jake Tapper's book. Now, I'm not in the business of advertising anybody else's work, so I'm not going to say the title or anything else like that. But just understand, well, I'll say it. Fine. It's called Original Sin, right? It's this new book by Jake Tapper. I want people to be very clear about this. I'm going to say this right up front because it's super duper important. I have not read Jake Tapper's book. I'm talking about what the book is about, right? So this is not an attack on Jake Tapper or anything else like that. I'm going to talk about what the book is about because I think it's very important. Topic number one, what do we expect out of journalists? Now, you guys have heard me. I'm very critical of how sort of mainstream journalism works sometimes, and the journalists who I think are great. I talk about Aaron Haynes. I talk about Michael Herrick. If there's great journalists out there, Joy Reid, great journalists out there, I'm going to talk about them, right? And journalists that I'm critical of, I'm going to be critical of. This is not really that, right? What I want to talk about is the fact that Jake Tapper's new book, Original Sin, is primarily about the cover-up of Joe Biden's mental decline. And the book has gotten all this new attention because people are like, oh my gosh, the White House knew that Joe Biden was like cognitively diminishing and that he couldn't remember the names of staffers and that, they did a Christmas party at 2022 at the White House and a lot of members of Congress hadn't seen him in the flesh again until the next Christmas party. That there were suggestions at one point that maybe he should be in a wheelchair. That terrible debate where he seemed to totally fritz out when he was going against Donald Trump in June of 2024, that people knew about that and basically they covered it up. Now, we can go back and forth as to whether or not any staffer should have done that, whether it was innocent enough, whether it was a good idea or a bad idea. I will go on record. I said this last year. I said this now. I think that Joe Biden, I didn't want him to drop out of the race, not because I thought he was the best candidate, but because I didn't think there would be enough time for Kamala Harris or anybody else to do anything. But here's the bigger issue. If there were journalists out there who had enough inside information and insight and people on and off the record who were saying Joe Biden is not mentally capable, not physically capable of doing this job. And by that, I mean also campaigning and speaking to people. If it is true that Joe Biden was at 40, 50 person fundraisers and he had to do them on Zoom because he wasn't physically capable of moving around the room and shaking hands and gripping grin. If there were journalists that knew that and had that on record and failed to report it because they wanted to save it for a book later, that is a problem. That is absolute journalistic malfeasance. I'm not saying that's what Jake Tapper did. I don't know when he began writing this book. But there's a larger discussion to be had about when journalists have access to information and whether or not they save it for a book that they want to write or report it to the public. If journalists knew that Joe Biden was that bad off in 2023 and early 2024, they had an obligation to tell people. I think there's a lot of people out there, and I put myself in this category. I have trouble forgiving anybody that knew that this man was as physically incapable as he was of performing the duties of the president, including campaigning, including speeches and stuff like that, and hid it because they were concerned about politics or legacy or anything else like that. I also want to make this clear, given the news that we just got this week. I think Joe Biden is a great man. I do. He was not always my favorite president, but I think he was sincere. I think he cared about this country. I think that he went through a lot of tragedy in his life, and he tried his best to run the country to the best of his ability. All that being said, if the man was in physical decline, it was the obligation of his party, his staff, and journalists who knew better to expose that, because that's relative and important to the public. We're not talking about whether or not somebody was having an affair. That's nobody's business, right? I mean, I'm old and I remember Bill Clinton, right? We're talking about if you know that Donald Trump is falling asleep during meetings, which you've heard reports about, that should be put out there. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing. We have obligations, and Tapper's book is just the first. There will be several other books coming out this summer that go over this topic. I hope these are all people talking about they start investigating after that debate, because if they sat on this information to sell a book, I think it's a real problem. Here's the second topic. Here's what's key. You guys are in a perfect position on this because I just got back from Cape Town, South Africa, and you saw that in my last commentary. I talked about being there. I talked about the white South Africaners, the Boers, and everything else like that. So today, President Ramaphosa of South Africa actually met with Donald Trump. And let me tell you something about this, because this is infuriating to me, but it's super duper important. The president of the United States is barely a president at this point. He is basically an autocrat preparing himself to be in complete control. And this is now the second or third meeting we've seen with him with another world leader where his whole goal is basically to insult that person, to make them look weak, to make them look stupid. For those who didn't suffer through the sit down with Ramaphosa and Trump, I did. He starts off by bringing out all these articles where he's like, oh, there's a white genocide going on in South Africa. Most of those articles were pictures from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. They weren't even from South Africa. Then he goes and shows a video, and I'm not going to go too far down this rabbit hole, but he found one political leader, a guy named Julius Malema, who was saying, kill the Boer, kill the Boer, kill the farmer, kill the Boer. And he's like, see, that's proof of white genocide. They're saying, kill the Boer, kill the farmer. For some context here, and I don't think a lot of the journalists out there did this proper context, kill the Boer, kill the farmer. These are anti-apartheid chats from the 60s and 70s and the 80s. Okay, that's what it is. It's like saying cowboys and Indians, right? We don't say cowboys and Indians today because it's considered kind of weird and offensive, but it's a reference to a way of conflict or fighting or a pop culture moment that we had in television and movies 50 or 60 years ago. That's what Kill the Boer is. Because when black folk in South Africa were having to physically fight to end apartheid, the Boers and the Afrikaners were a large part of that oppression. So to show that video and say, aha, this proves that there's genocide in South Africa is kind of like finding a video of Jesse Jackson in 1979 saying, fight the power or take down the white man and saying, aha, that proves that he hates white people. No, it was a chant at the time. And anybody who showed that video and didn't put that context in it is basically playing into Trump's hands. Now, I got to give credit to President Ramaphosa. The ANC has not done the greatest job. They've been running that country for about 35 years. But he basically took like Marshawn Lynch diplomacy to sitting down. He saw what happened to Zelensky. He saw Zelensky get insulted. He saw when Carney and Trump were interacting with each other. All that guy wanted to do, all Ramaphosa wanted to do, Marshawn Lynch, I'm just here so I don't get fined. I want American investment. I want to get the heck out of this meeting. I want to get the heck out of this country. He did an okay job. When the President Trump tried to say that there's a white genocide going on, I think Ramaphosa did a pretty good job of being like, yeah, that's not true. We have a crime problem. It's not a white crime problem. Yes, that individual, Julius Malema, who you showed in the video, he's a part of a small fringe political party. This is a guy whose visa is being denied. They won't even let him go speak in Cambridge, South Africa, right? He's like, this is not generally how our country operates. I also think it's fairly smart on Ramaphosa's behalf. He knows who Donald Trump is. Right? This is a man who needs flattery. This is a man who's fairly simple. This is a man who got played by letting the Qataris dump off a terrible $40 billion jet that they couldn't sell, that they ended up giving the United States, and now we have to pay for. So what did he do in order to sort of grease the wheels with Donald Trump? He brought Retief Goosen and Ernie Els, right? These are South African golfers. And what is Donald Trump like? He loves golf. So having white South African golfers there to talk to the president and say, hey, there's no white genocide going. It was a brilliant move. So overall, was it another sort of offensive, terrible press conference with Donald Trump? Of course it was. Overall, did Ramaphosa equip himself well? Yeah, I think if you were a South African citizen, you'd be happy. Overall, has our media equipped itself well? From what I've seen so far, not really. There's some really specific insights to this that I think were missed as far as what kill the Boer means, what the actual numbers are that I've talked about when it comes to these notions of white genocide. The fact that you brought 59 people to the United States while shutting down sort of amnesty access and all sorts of other people coming to this country, but you do it for some white folks because you've got this racist South African Elon Musk. All those things weren't discussed enough. It was a bit of a problem, but overall, it was an important news day, and I think Ramaphosa did fine. If you're South African, you'd be happy. Now, number three, super huge, and this is complicated, so I'm going to be fairly quick about it. I am an original WNBA watcher. I just want to put that out there. I'm an original like when the WNBA launched in the 90s, I liked the Comets, right? Because you had Swole Swoops and Cooper and Tina Thompson, who I thought was like better than Chris Webber, who eventually went on to actually be the women's basketball coach at the University of Virginia, which is my alma mater. I've paid attention to the WNBA at the very beginning. And then I lost interest for about 10 or 12 years. And then I started paying attention again because of these new groups of people you've got. You got Paige coming in this year. We'll have Juju coming in eventually because of Angel Reese and Caitlyn Clarke. Yeah, those people brought it back. I gotta say this though, there's a very interesting thing that we have seen over this last year and a half, which is you have a lot of people who don't know anything about women's basketball, have never cared about women's basketball, who've jumped into the sport because they want to make themselves look special to some particular constituency. You got a lot of racist people like Dave Portnoy from Barstool Sports and Clay Travis and all sorts of racist white guys who, if you had asked them 2 years ago, they would have made fun of the WNBA for not being real basketball, but suddenly they care about it because Caitlyn Clarke is this white girl who's really, really good, and that gives them an opportunity to attack black women under the guise that they actually care about sports. That's the dynamic we've seen with the WNBA. It's sad because there's actually some good basketball to watch, but a lot of the conversation, unfortunately, revolves around these sorts of kabuki games that people want to play with race and gender and sexuality. I want to say this real quick, though, about this commentary. RG3, who is a former professional football player, he was the quarterback for the now Washington Commanders, and he made a comment saying, oh, there's hatred between Angel Reese and Caitlyn Clarke after there was a hard foul in the game last week. Then Ryan Clarke, who is an analyst who I think is great, who's one of the hosts of the Pivot Podcast, I encourage people to go to Pivot Podcast, was like, look, the reason Ryan Clarke was saying what he was saying about Angel Reese is because he's married to a white woman and he doesn't understand that competition could be going on between a black woman and a white woman and it doesn't have to be hatred. I could do a whole podcast on this, but I just want to say this up front. Number one, I really wish that when it comes to women's sports that we could just talk about sports, right? Whether it's soccer or it's basketball or whatever it is, instead of talking about race and gender. And I also say this fairly quickly. You may not like what Ryan Clarke had to say, and it's perfectly reasonable to say that somebody can provide quality sports analysis regardless of who they happen to be partnered with. But I can't lie and say that partner selection is a political process, and who you are partnered with will have an impact on how people can see that you analyze sports. I talk to many black women that I know in particular who are in sports journalism who say all the time that the fact that many of the men on some of the bigger networks talking about sports, that some of their inability to talk about women's sports well is because they're not married or they don't have functional relationships with women. And when you have that going on, when you don't have someone who might be in the identity of the sport that you're talking about, it might limit your ability to speak on it well. Not saying that RG3's white wife makes him any less capable of talking about sports, but I am saying that you do open yourself up to a certain kind of criticism if you can't demonstrate that you have any other connection to the sport and you end up saying things that are considered sexist and racist. At the end of the day, Angel Reese and Caitlyn Clarke are both amazing athletes. They could both beat me on the court. I can't play basketball to save my life. Now at this point, and reducing a sports rivalry with two young women who have spent their entire careers trying to become as efficient as they can on the basketball court to just racial or gender hate, I think is stupid. I think it diminishes the sport, and I think it keeps a lot of other people who might otherwise be interested disinterested because they just don't want to hear a bunch of racist nonsense that people want to play out. Anyway, that's 3 things. Please like, subscribe, and share. And the announcement that I wanted to make really quick, I'm going to do a live stream. Yes, I'm going to do a Q&A live stream probably sometime next week, so I'll keep you guys updated. I post these every 5 days. Please like, subscribe, and share. This is Jason Johnson. Catch you later. Oh, yes, and the latest t-shirt, like I said, I'm going to start putting up t-shirt things. This is Miles Davis. It's a great album. Thought you guys would like it. Later.